Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf lamed bet. I'll remind everybody that the Sukkah Challenge is starting today. We have a lot of people registered already, and if you want to add more people to the list, feel free to share around the challenge. Today's daf is sponsored by Meryl Page in loving memory of her father, George Levine, Yosef Michael Halevi. Dad cherished his family and learning and remains a constant presence in my life. Today's daf is sponsored by Amy Kuhn for the refuah shlema of her daughter, Katriella Nava Bat Amy Batya, who had to undergo knee surgery today. Batzlacha. Okay, we're going to get started with the bottom of Lamed Aleph Hamud Bet. If you remember what we were learning about yesterday, okay, first of all, there's two things I want to review. One is this machloket, Rabbi Natan and the rabbis, about intent. Intent for slaughtering. Do you need intent for slaughtering an animal for it to be considered a kosher shechita? So Rabbi Natan said you don't need intent. If it just happened by accident, it's fine. It's considered a shechita as long as it was done in a proper way. But if the rabbi said, no, you need intent for the act, right? If you don't have any intent to do it, it's not relevant, right? Like you were throwing a knife across the room, happened to graze the neck of the animal and slaughter it, that's not going to be shechita. The other thing we should review before we get here is that a few days ago on Daf Kaftet Amud Bet, we learned that we quoted this Mishnah, Masechet Para, that Kol ha'usukim b'para mitchila v'ad sof mitamim begadim. Remember, all the people involved in the shechita of the para, their clothes are impure, they have impurity, and that was all about the shechita l'tchila v'ad sof and all that. Then there was this line that we really didn't deal with because it wasn't relevant to our sugya, upuslin otah b'melacha acheret. Now, what this means is that while you're slaughtering the para aduma, you're also doing something else. Okay, and today we're going to see, like for example, slaughtering another animal, then that's a disqualification in the para aduma. So the para aduma is not going to be kosher if while you're slaughtering that animal, you also slaughter another animal. So now we're going to combine these two issues together. Now, by the way, that's learned out, and we're going to see it in a few minutes. It's learned out from the words v'shachat ota. You slaughter it and nothing else. You can't be doing anything else while you're slaughtering it. So, amarava, shachat para v'shachat be'ema acheret ima l'divrei hakol psula. So everybody agrees, and this is what I just said. If you're slaughtering the para aduma, and while you're slaughtering it, you're also slaughtering another animal, right? Like our Mishnah with the two animals, one, at the same time, going with the knife over both of them. So everyone agrees that that's disqualified because you've ruined the para aduma because you were doing a different malacha with it. Nishchita behema acheret ima. What if it's not shachat but nishchita by accident? Okay, somehow while you were moving the knife, you didn't realize there was another animal right there, and you somehow managed to slaughter the animal. Again, these cases are likely unrealistic, but what they're trying to get to is the concept about intent. If without any intent, I slaughtered another animal while I was doing the para aduma, well, now it depends. This is going to be called a malacha if it's a valid action. Okay, now we're going to see that the leniency of Rabbi Natan of saying, well, we're going to consider it a kosher slaughter even if you didn't intend for it to be a kosher, you didn't even intend to slaughter the animal. Well, he's actually going to have a stringency here because since nishchita be'ema acheret, according to him, if accidentally you didn't even mean to, without meaning to, the animal was slaughtered, and we're going to consider that a valid shechita, then that's going to be what we call melacha acheret here, okay? And then the Rabbi Natan para psula behema kshera. So let's start with the end. Since the behema is kshera, because the slaughter was a kosher slaughter according to Rabbi Natan, therefore the para aduma is disqualified because you did some other action with it. But le Rabbanan, the rabbis are going to say, para kshera behema psula. He comes up with the opposite. The animal is not able to be eaten, that animal that you unintentionally slaughtered, because that's not a kosher shechita, because for shechita you need intent according to the rabbis. Therefore, the para aduma is actually going to be completely valid because it wasn't a malacha. Now it's an interesting thing. What we're going to say is a shechita that's not a kosher shechita, right? If I didn't intend to slaughter the animal, let's go back to the case of throwing the knife across the room. the fact that the animal got slaughtered, that's not an action, according to the rabbis. It's not a kosher shechita. It's like as if nothing happened. So if while I was throwing the para aduma, nothing really happened, even though I happened to slaughter another animal, but we don't consider that anything, well, then it's not a disqualification of the para aduma, because you need it to be a malacha. This isn't a malacha. It's not an action. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't this kind of obvious? So they said, well, the chiddush is this. Why did they tell us this? Specifically for the following case. They needed it for the case where a different animal got slaughtered, and according to Rabbi Natan, we said that that's going to disqualify the para aduma. Now, why? Why did you need this case? You might have thought, now I told you where this whole issue comes from the words vishachat ota. Now, what does ota mean? You slaughter it and nothing else. Now, what do you think nothing else means? If you had just read it without having this sugya, you would have thought, slaughter it, slaughter one para aduma, not two para adumas at the same time. Okay, that's what they say. So, the Torah says, shachat it, below ota v'chaverta, and not it and another para aduma, another red heifer. V'hechidami, what's the case of ota v'chaverta, as I already told you? That you did two para adumas at the same time. That would disqualify. But maybe you would think that a behemah that's a regular animal, maybe that's not part of this disqualification. Kamash malan, that's why they need to tell us, no, it is. And then the chiddush is that if even Rabbi Natan, who says, right, that even if you didn't even intend to slaughter the animal, we're still going to consider that a kosher shechita, then that's going to be a disqualification of this para aduma from the words v'shachat ota. And that wasn't super intuitive. You wouldn't have necessarily known that because you might have thought shachat ota is only coming to exclude another para aduma. So now what we have is shachat ota is coming to exclude doing some other action at the same time. What so far do we have on our list of actions? Slaughtering another para aduma, slaughtering another animal, just a Chullin animal, and we said, even according to Rabbi Natan, even if it happened without any intent. Now we're going to add another case. And here we're going to have a bit of a differentiation between this and the slaughtering. Chatach delatima. What if you were cutting a gourd with it, okay, or a pumpkin? Divrei kol psula. That's considered malacha. And you're also doing an action. You're cutting a pumpkin, and while you're cutting this para aduma, that's going to disqualify as well. So now we're extending. Shachat ota, slaughter it, and don't cut something else. That's also a disqualifying action. However, in this case, it's not exactly like the shechita, because nichtecha delatima, if it just got cut in the action of slaughtering the para aduma, let's say right behind its neck was a pumpkin, and you somehow accidentally cut the pumpkin, tivrei kol kshera. That everyone's going to agree that there's no problem here. Even Rabbi Natan, who says that an unintentional shechita is called shechita, an unintentional cut of a gourd is not really called cutting, or a pumpkin is not really called cutting a pumpkin, and that's not going to disqualify your para aduma, in case you were worried. Okay, next Mishnah. Now we're going to get to, we happen to be on Daf Lamed Bet, which we may mention of a bunch of times. And the reason is because we're going to have these two Mishnayot which discuss a lot of the disqualifications. Remember, there's 5 disqualifications in shechita. Okay, let's try to remember them. Shehiya, which is going to be the subject of this Mishnah. Ikur and Chalada, which is the subject of the next Mishnah. Hagrama, which is doing it in the wrong place. And which one am I missing? I was going to have trouble recalling them all. There's one that I'm missing. Hagrama, shehiya. Oh, drisa. Right, that's pushing down on the neck forcefully, as opposed to the back and forth motion. That we already did. So now we're going to talk about these disqualifications. The first Mishnah is going to talk all about shehiya, and then we're going to have a whole, we're going to have a machloket in the Mishnah. What shehiya? How much time you have to wait? Shehiya means waiting in between the two simanim. How long that is. We're going to see machloket tanaim, and then we're going to see machloket amoraim within one of the opinions of the machloket tanaim. Okay, so with that, let's get started. Nafla sakin v'higbiha. My knife fell in the middle of the shechita, and I went to pick it up, so I stopped in the middle. Naflu kela v'higbiha. My clothes fell, and I picked them up. Okay, unlikely your clothes just fall off. Maybe your headgear fell off, and you went to pick it up. Hishchiz et hasakin. Okay, there's 2 ways to read this next, whether it's 2 cases or 1. I'll read it first as 2, and then I'll read it as 1. Hishchiz et hasakin. You need to sharpen the knife in the middle of shechita, so you stopped. Or ve'af, uba chavero v'shachat, or you got tired, like ayef. You got tired, and someone else came and finished up the shechita, so there was also a break. Okay, all these are cases of breaks. Alternatively, you could read it as hishchiz et hasakin. You went to sharpen the knife, and in the meanwhile, you got tired, maybe from the work of sharpening the knife, and then you basically had someone else switch you. That's another way to read it. Anyway, either which way, im shaha kidei shechita psula. If you waited long enough to slaughter an animal, it's disqualified. Rabbi Shimon omer im shaha kidei bikur. If you waited long enough to check. Okay, we're going to see this means to check the knife. The amount of time it takes to check the knife, that's the amount of time it's disqualified. According to Rabbi Shimon, according to the rabbis, it's enough time that you could do a shechita. So what does it mean to do a shechita? Does it mean to finish the shechita, what you're up to? Does it mean to start a whole shechita from beginning to end? So, my kedei shechita, what does this mean? The Gemara asks, Amarav kedei shechita behema acheret. So Rav qualifies what it means here and says it means the amount of time it takes to slaughter an animal from start to finish. Not wherever you're up to and how much longer it would have taken you to finish, right? But how long it takes to slaughter an animal. Amri la Rav Kana v'Rav Asi l'Rav. Now Rav Kana and Rav Asi come to Rav with a reasonable question. Kedei shechita be'ema le'be'ema ve'of la'of. Does it mean if you're slaughtering an animal, that's the amount of time it would take to slaughter an animal? And if you're slaughtering a bird, the amount of time it takes to slaughter a bird, which would obviously be less time. Because it obviously takes less time to slaughter a bird than it does an animal. O dilma af be'ema la'of. Or is it just shehiya in general, whether you're slaughtering a bird or whether you're slaughtering an animal, is the amount of time it takes to slaughter an animal, even if you're slaughtering a bird, which would mean that would be a leniency, because it wouldn't be such a short amount of time that would disqualify your shechita. You would need a longer period of time to disqualify your shechita if you were doing a bird. So Amar Lahu, Rav has a very interesting answer. He says, Lo hava b'dichna be b'chavivi di'ishayle. I wasn't feeling close enough to chavivi. Now, it's a funny thing to say. B'dichna shows closeness. I wasn't feeling close enough to chavivi. Now, chavivi is his uncle. It's what he calls Rabbi Chia. But chavivi is a term of endearment. So it's kind of funny. On the one hand, he's saying, I wasn't really close to this person that I call chavivi, as if he's my, someone I love. Di'ishayle. I wasn't comfortable enough, which is just interesting in and of itself, that Rav wasn't comfortable enough with Rabbi Chia to ask him this question. So he's basically saying, I don't know. And I didn't ask my rabbi because I was not feeling comfortable enough to ask him. However, even though Rav answers them and says, I don't really have an answer to your question, somehow later, Rav has an answer. Because we're going to see, Itmar, it was said, and we're going to now have a machloket Rav and Shmuel about this. Amarav, kedei shechita be'ema le'be'ema ve'of la'of. He says, when you're doing a bird, it's the amount of time for a bird. Okay, which basically is a stringency. So it might not be he had an answer. It could be he was just being stringent because he didn't have an answer. So he said better to go err on the side of being stringent. Or maybe he decided this was the answer. Maybe he found out from someone else later. We don't know. But he does rule that for an animal, it's time for an animal. For a bird, it's time for the bird. Shmuel amal afilu be'ema la'of. Okay, Shmuel's on the other side of this argument, and he says even the amount of time it takes to slaughter an animal would be the same time. Right, that is the continuous. That's always, no matter what, in every case, that's going to be the amount of time that's going to disqualify your shechita if you waited the amount of time to slaughter an animal, even if you're doing a bird. V'chein kiata Rabin amar Rabbi Yochanan. Also, not just did Shmuel say this, but when Rabin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that even behema la'of, even an animal, okay, says the same thing as Shmuel. When you're doing birds, it's the amount of time it takes to slaughter an animal. Okay, so far we have, number one, we said kedei shechita is a different animal. Okay, not that we really thought otherwise, but from start to finish. And now we have a machloket about a bird. Is it the amount of time it takes to slaughter an animal, or is it a smaller period of time that's going to disqualify it, which is the amount of time it takes to slaughter a bird? Now, Rabbi Chanina, it says Chananya, but it should be Chanina Amal, he brings a different explanation. Kedei sheyavi behema acheret v'yishchot. It's the amount of time it takes to bring a different animal and slaughter it. Okay, to bring a different animal, that's obviously a lot more time. So he's going to only disqualify it if you really waited a longer time. To which the Gemara says, Yavi, afilu me'alma? Wait, you're talking about bring from wherever? Okay, now, natata dvarecha l'shiurim, or in Ken, if so, natata dvarecha l'shiurim, what does that mean? It means for everyone's going to be a different time. If I have a farm, and animals in my backyard grazing there, it's very short. If I have an animal in the room with me, it's even shorter. If I have to go to the shuk and buy an animal to get one, it's going to be much, much longer. So there's no real amount here. We can't have a system where it just depends. However, the amount of time that you personally would have taken on that day at that moment to go find an animal and slaughter it, that makes no sense. That we're going to have an answer or an amount of time here that's going to be completely dependent on everyone's unique situation. So Rav Papa explains Rabbi Chanina as saying, Omedet lahatil ikabenayu. What they mean here is, it's the amount of time it takes to put the animal down and slaughter it. It doesn't mean to buy or bring another animal. It means to bring the animal to the location that you need it slaughtered, meaning your animal's standing, you need to bring it to a lying down position so that you can do the slaughter. So it means the slaughter plus the prep time, the amount of time it takes to get your animal down. And then that's a particular amount of time that shouldn't depend on each individual person. Amrei b'ma'arav mishmei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. In Israel, they said in the name of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, here's a fourth answer. In other words, we have of la'of and be'ema la'be'ema. We have even be'ema la'of. Okay, that was Shmuel. Then we have the amount of time it takes to put the animal on the ground and slaughter it. And now we have kadesh yag bihena v'yarbitzena v'yishchot. You have enough to lift the animal, push it down, okay, like beat it up to get it down, and slaughter it. Now here we make even further differentiations, and we say, well, for a small animal, it would be the amount of time it would take to lift this small animal, push it down on the ground, and slaughter it. For a big animal, it would be the amount of time it takes to do in a big animal, because obviously there's going to be a differentiation between a large animal and a small animal. How long it's going to take you to pick up this animal, put it down on the ground. I don't even know if you would pick up an animal that's a large animal. I could see a small animal, yes, but a large animal not really lifting, and it would just be putting it on the ground. So for each animal, right, and it's appropriate for its size. And as we don't differentiate all different sizes, small, medium, large, but we have large animals, small animals, right? That's the cattle family and the sheep family that we always make these distinctions between. Okay, so there were 4 different explanations about this kidei shechita. Amarava, hashochet b'sakin ra'a, afilu kol hayom kulo kshera. If you use a bad knife, what's a bad knife? One that's not very sharp. If it takes you all day, now if you're using a really blunt knife, then it's going to take a very long time to slaughter the animal. Okay, they're obviously exaggerating here, but even if it takes you the entire day, it's still fine. Then Rava asked the following question. The Gemara is going to say, hey, couldn't you answer your question from what you just said a minute ago? I mean, again, it's not like you said a minute ago, but for us it was a minute. So by Rava says, shehiyot ma'u sheyitzdarfu. What if you start slaughtering, you stop, you take a little break, but not enough of a break, just a little break. Then you continue on, and then you take another break. And if you add up all those breaks together, you're going to get to the shear of shechita. But if you didn't, right, if you don't add them up, each individual one is not long enough to ruin your shechita. So is that a disqualification or not? Do we join them together and say there's one amount for doing this? To which they answer, "V'tifshal le'midida." Why don't you answer from your own question? We just talked about if you have a blunt knife and it takes you all day long to slaughter the animal, don't you assume that means there's breaks in between? So they say, no, hatam b'delo shaha. No, what do you mean? No, you're working straight without any breaks. That's not a case where you took a break and took another break, right? They assumed if you're working on this all day, you must have taken short breaks, and just each time too short to be a problem, and then that means they don't join. But no, they say no. When it said kol hayom kulo, it meant you were constantly dealing with it. You didn't take any breaks at all, or at least not any breaks that would have even added up to the problematic time. By Rav Huna b'rei Rav Natan, so basically his question is left unanswered. By Rav Huna b'rei Rav Natan, shaha b'mi'ut simanim mahu. What if you did the majority of the simanim, and then now at that point you have a kosher shechita, but then you waited, and then you finish slaughtering the rest of the simanim. You basically cut them completely. Now, you don't really need to do that, and therefore it would seem to be pretty obvious that it would be a problem, but it's not obvious to them, and they end this also with a teku, right? Mi'ut simanim means the minority. If you waited before finishing that minority that was left, is that considered shehiya or not? And they're left with no answer, teku. So these last two questions we had no answer about. Now Rabbi Shimon Omer, im shahak kedei bikur. So now we go back to Rabbi Shimon's opinion. That was all 4 different explanations, and then 2 questions about the disqualification of shehiya, if you hold the shehiya is the amount of time for slaughtering another animal. Rabbi Shimon says, Im shahak kedei bikur, to check the knife. Okay, what are you checking the knife for? I saw someone else in the chat. You're checking the knife for nicks. You're not checking the knife for how sharp it is. Okay, that was clear from that other sugya. You're checking the knife for nicks, because if the knife has nicks in it, right, it's going to create a treifa in the animal before you finish slaughtering it. But anyway, that's not so important for these purposes. What we're trying to say is, what is kedei bikur? Amar Rabbi Yochanan kedei bikuro shel chacham, for the inspection of a chacham. Now, because remember, you're supposed to bring it to a chacham to check your knife. So the Gemara asks, like we asked before, in kenatat devracha l'shiurim. I might live next door to the chacham. I might have a chacham in my house, right? My husband might be one. I might have a chacham, right, far away in the next door town, right? That could be, right, that if we're counting how much time it takes me to get to the chacham and ask the chacham, that could be a really long time. And for each person, it's going to be different. We can't have a shear an amount like that. It must be, we're talking about the amount of time it would take the slaughterer himself if he were the chacham to check his knife. Okay, that's shehiya. Now we're moving on to the next set of disqualifications. We're going to get to ikur, which I'll explain in a minute, and chalada, which we've already discussed a lot. Shachatet haveshet upasaket hargargeret, o pasaket hargargeret v'achar kach shachatet haveshet. Okay, remember that these are 2 different cases, opposite order. You slaughter the veshet, okay, and then pasaket hargargeret. So you slaughter the gullet, and then you break, okay, or akira could be you uproot. In this case, you break the gargeret. You don't slaughter it with your knife, but you cause the windpipe, right? The gargeret, kaneh, they're the same thing. The windpipe, you cause it to be cut more than 50% and basically ruin it, but without doing it with your shechita knife in the proper way of shechita. Or you first pasaket gargeret, and then you shechted properly the veshet, okay? Or, so that's basically called akira. You uprooted one of the simanim, either before you slaughter the other one or after you slaughter the other one. It seems by the Mishnah, it doesn't really matter. O shechata mehem v'imtin la'ad shemeta. Or you just cut one, you slaughter one of them, and then you left the animal to die, and right, you left it basically to die after cutting only one siman. O shechlita tasakin tachar hasheni upsako. You put the knife, remember, under the hide, behind the 2 simanim, or we've learned also in between the 2 simanim, and then you go with this forward motion going forward, right? Instead of like you're going from back to forward to front, rather than from front to back, and you're doing it from behind and underneath the hide and going outward. Rabbi Yeshiva omer nevela, Rabbi Akiva omer treifa. We have a machloket in this Mishnah now, but it actually relates to the previous Mishnah as well. And any disqualifications of an incorrect shechita, these 5 disqualifications we talked about. Is it a nevela or is it a treifa? What's the nafkamina, whether we say nevela or treifa? Because nevela carries impurity. So if the meat is nevela and it touches something, right, it'll make a person, kelim, it'll make it impure. If it's a treifa, there's no impurity. So we're going to have this machloka, Rabbi Shevav and Rabbi Akiva, whether it's nevela or a treifa. Now Rabbi Shevav is going to explain his opinion. Klal amar Rabbi Yeshiva mishum Rabbi Yoshua. Right, so now we learn it's not really his opinion, it's Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. Kol shenifsela b'shchitata nevela. If the shechita is disqualified, the shechita itself, it's a nevela. That's all these psulim we've been talking about. Kosher shechitata karaoi, but if you did a kosher shechita, v'davar acher garam la lipasel, but there was something else that caused it to be disqualified, like for example, after you found there was a hole in the lung, or you found there was a hole in one of the stomachs, and we're going to have a whole list of all these treifot on Daf Mem Bet when we get to the beginning of the next chapter, and throughout the next chapter, it's what makes an animal a treifa. So if there's something else, there's nothing to do with your shechita. You slaughtered it completely fine. Just it happened there was some problem in the animal. That's a treifa. And then after he explained this, Hodalo Rabbi Akiva. The Mishnah ends with Rabbi Akiva agreeing with Rabbi Yeshevav. You know what? You're right. These cases are not treifas. I agree with your distinction. If the shechita, okay, get this in your head, this is very important. If the shechita is the wrong, you did it wrong, waited, ikor, you uprooted the other siman, not slaughtered it, something like that, chalada, hagrama, all those, then the shechita is not a good shechita, and therefore it's an avela. But if you had a kosher shechita, right, there's this concept, the shechita tam mitaheret mi treifata. The shechita, a kosher shechita, permits a treifa, not for eating, it's a treifa, it can't be eaten, but yes, from impurity. Okay, and then it's called a treifa. It's going to create a big problem because you haven't seen the Mishnah yet in the beginning of the third chapter, but we're going to see it right now. And we're going to see that completely contradicts what we just said. Shachat tabeshet v'chulei v'hodalo Rabbi Akiva. Okay, they basically say reread the whole Mishnah, which we just read, so we don't need to do that. But the main point being that in the end, Rabbi Akiva agrees these are all nevelot. But in Ramini, this contradicts the first Mishnah there in the next chapter. Elu treifot b'beima. Turning now to Amabed. These are the treifot in an animal. Look what's listed here. Nikubata veshet. Okay, if you have a hole, one little tear, perforation in the veshet, okay, that's not an issue for us. Upsukata gargeret. But if the windpipe is broken, right? More than 50% of it is cut open, that's a treifa. Now, look at our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? But now, what did we say? If it's a treifa and you slaughter it properly, then it's fine, right? What does it say here? Pasaket gargeret v'achar kach shachat taveshet. Now, if you broke the gargeret first, which made the animal a treifa, and then you continued to slaughter and you slaughtered the veshet, well, now it's slaughtered, right? It's like a kosher shechita, but what's the problem, right? In our Mishnah, it says it would be an avela. In that next chapter, it says it's a treifa. So we're going to have an issue here. So we're going to have 4 answers to answer this question. 2 of them will ultimately be rejected, but 2 of them will not be rejected. So I'm a Rava. The first 2 are Rava because Rava is going to give an answer. Then the Gemara is going to reject it. Rav Acha is going to say, you're wrong. You can't say that. We're going to have a back and forth. And then Rava is going to say, okay, I guess you're right. And then he's going to give a different answer. I'm a Rava. Lo kashya. How are we going to resolve the contradiction between that Mishnah and this Mishnah? Kan sheshachat ulevasof pasak. Kan shepasak ulevasof shachat. It all depends on the order. If first you slaughtered the animal, and then you broke the siman after the second siman, right? You slaughtered the veshet, you then cut the kaneh, or the gargeret, right? The same thing. Then we're going to call that an avela, because, right, you slaughtered first, then broke the other one. There was no shechita of that second siman. That's not a kosher shechita. That's an avela, right? Your shechita is completely wrong. That's ikor. But kan, in the second Mishnah, in the next chapter, you were pasak. It broke first, so now there's no need to slaughter it. It's already cut. Ulevasof shachat. And then you continued and went on to cut the veshet. So now you have basically a kosher shechita, but the animal's a treifa. So that's going to be a treifa. It's not really a kosher shechita. It's just you did the act of shechting properly. Okay, it's a little bit. You didn't really, because you didn't shecht the gargeret, right? The kaned or the gargeret. You didn't, right? It was already cracked and open. But you basically continued along there and just finished it up by doing the veshet, and that's going to be a treifa. Okay, and now we're going to explain exactly which is which, even though we did already, but the Gemara is going to say so. Shachatu levasof pasak. If you slaughter it first, this is just a review. You slaughter it first, and then it gets cracked. The second one, you slaughter the first siman, the second siman, then you break. Nifselet b'shchitahi. That's just a completely disqualified shechita, and that's why it's an avela. Right? Remember, if you go back to the distinction that Rabbi Yeshevav explained, pasak ulevasof shachat, but if it broke first and then you slaughtered it, hi davar acher garam li pasel damya. This is like something else caused it, not your shechita. It wasn't like your shechita was wrong. It's just there was some problem in the animal, which is the gargeret was already cracked. Okay. Sounds like a reasonable answer. However, it completely doesn't match the language of our Mishnah, if you've paid attention. Because our Mishnah, let me just go back. Okay, we're going to see it right now, so I guess we don't have to go back. But Eitive Rav Acha Bar Huna l'Rava, he says, I'm going to raise difficulty from our Mishnah. Shachat et haveshet, this is the first line. If you slaughter the veshet and then pasak et gargeret, or pasak et gargeret v'achar kach shachat et haveshet, and then in the end the Mishnah says both these cases are in avela. Our Mishnah already brought both those two cases. So you can't say our Mishnah is talking about one and the next Mishnah is talking about the other when our Mishnah mentions exactly both those cases. And they're both a nevela, according to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah didn't distinguish to say that one's a nevela, that one's a treifa. So it's hard to imagine how Rabbi even said that. So now Rabbi is going to try to answer. And he says, Ema, when our Mishnah says the problematic line, which is if first the gargeret was broken and then you slaughtered the veshet, which we now say that's a treifa. So he says, read that line differently. Pasaket gargeret, you broke the gargeret, ukvar shachatet haveshet meikara, but you had already slaughtered the veshet beforehand. Okay, that's how he rereads that line. Okay, which obviously there's major problems with doing that. We're going to have the two issues that Rav Acha raises right now. Amarle, Rav Acha says, shtei tshuvot b'davar. Tshuva I usually think is an answer, but in the Gemara, tshuva is a response. And here it means I have two difficulties against you. In fact, the word etive, which we just read, which is when someone brings a tannaitic source to contradict an amora, etive also comes from the language of lahashiv, okay, because yatav is yashav. Lahashiv is from answer, but it really means a difficulty. Okay? So he says, I have two difficulties with what you just said. Chada dahainu kamaita. If you change the second line to say, first you slaughtered the veshet and then you broke the gargeret, it's exactly the same as the previous line. And then you have two sentences saying exactly the same thing. Ve'od hatzna va'acharkach. And the other thing is, the Mishnah says, and after you cut the veshet, not slaughtered the veshet, and before you had already slaughtered the veshet. That's basically taking these words and making them the complete opposite of what they say. So that's obviously not a good answer. So Rava admits, okay, not the best answer. I'm going to try for a different one. Ella Amar Rava. And this answer will stand. Okay, this is not one that's going to be rejected. Okay, answers 1 and 3 will be rejected. Elu asurot katane. V'yesh mehen nevelot, v'yesh mehen trefot. He says, oh, you're worried because the next Mishnah says now, okay, the next chapter, the name of the next chapter is Elu Trefot. And it starts with, these are the Trefot and the Behemah, and it lists all the Trefos and animals. Okay, there's something to look forward to in the next chapter. We're going to get into all the nitty-gritty details of what makes an animal a Trefa. Now, it says there, Nikuvata, the first cases are Nikuvata Veshet, Upsukata Gargeret. So what do they say? Oh, don't take this so literally, Elu Trefot. These are Trefas. Read it as, these are forbidden to eat. Some of them are trefas and some of them are nevelas. Mainly, one of them is a nevela. Okay, our case. So that's a rereading. It's not maybe the strongest, but it's a rereading of that next Mishnah to basically resolve it with our Mishnah. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. If it's listing there nevelot also, then it's missing a bunch. Okay, we're going to now list 2 other nevelot that you would put in there if you were listing nevelot as well, and they're not, which means it's probably only trefot. Why don't we say Chizkiya's case? If you chop an animal in 2, either lengthwise or widthwise, it's considered a nevela. In fact, even if the animal's still flailing and moving, it's immediately considered a nevela, which means whoever's in contact with it, touches it, is going to become impure. So why isn't that in the list if it's listing nevelot as well? How about the one Rabbi Elazar says? If you take out the thigh and you see the space where it's missing the thigh, then it's also a nevela even if the animal is still moving and looks alive. It's immediately considered, it's like pronouncing the animal dead at that point. So why wouldn't those 2 be mentioned if that Mishnah mentions nevelot as well? So it's a weakness in Rava's theory that there's also nevelas there, but Rava has an answer, or the Gemara has an answer for Rava. Ki katani nevela de lo matama mechayim, aval nevela matama mechayim lo katani. When it talked about nevelot there, it was talking about nevelot, meaning our case of the kaneh being cut. Now, if the kaneh is cut and then you saw the animal is dead at that point. So it's talking about an animal that the law of nevela only kicks in when the animal's actually dead, as opposed to the two cases we just mentioned, the gistera and the taking out the calf, and you can see the place where it's missing. Both those animals, as I said already when explaining them, are pronounced nevelot even when they're still alive. So, because they're going to die any second, but it's enough at that point to already say we know for sure they're going to die, they're already nevela at that point. So we're basically going to say, yes, it added a case of nevela there, but only a nevela that's considered nevela when it's already dead, and not ones that are considered nevelas when they're still moving. Okay, why it would do that and that, right? It's again, not the most convincing answer, but it's not rejected. Third answer, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar, kan shechachat bimkom chatach, kan shechachat shelo bimkom chatach. If you remember the kaneh and the veshet, right, they're both cylinders basically, and they're long, and you can cut along at any point, or right, there's a limit where exactly, but you can cut in many different points. Okay, you just have to cut completely, right? Majority of in both of these cylinders. So now they say, if you're shachat, now remember what happened. You start cutting the veshet, or the gargeret was already cut. Now, if you cut the veshet and then continue along and do a little more of the gargeret, right? We're assuming you must do some sort of act of shechita there. Where it was already cut, okay, then you basically did nothing, right? Because the gargeret was already more than the majority of it was cut. So even if you cut more of it, it's irrelevant because it's already cut. Okay, that's one case. Shachat bimkom chatach. You slaughtered it where the cut was. Okay, so if, I'm just going to read on a little more now. Shachat, and we'll go back to the second case in a minute, but the Gemara explains it, so let's read it inside. Shachat bimkom chatach nifsila b'shchitahi. Our Mishnah is talking about the case where the gargeret was cut already, more than 50%. Then you cut by the veshet, and you continue along in the kaneh, in the gargeret, in the windpipe, but it was already cut. So even though maybe you cut a little more, it doesn't matter because it was already majority cut, which means that you didn't do an act of shechita there because it was already cut. But shelo bimkom chatach ki davar acher garam la lipasel damya. But if you did it, let's say you're cutting at this line, okay? You cut the veshet, you continue on, you cut the kaneh. Now the spot where you cut the kaneh was perfectly intact. It was just a little below it, it was detached, okay? But you cut above it. So at that point, what is that? It's a perfectly kosher shechita because you cut the veshet, you cut the kaneh where it wasn't cut already. So you did actually a cut of more than 50% of the kaneh, and it just happened to be that a little bit below or a little bit above it was already cut. But that is basically like a shechita. That was a kosher shechita. You just had some problem in the animal that it was a treifa, and that's what the next chapter is talking about. So we're basically, according to Rish Lakish, we're talking about depends on where you cut. Did you cut exactly where it was already cut, which then your cut means nothing, which means it's not a kosher shechita, or did you cut somewhere else, which means kosher shechita, which would preclude it from becoming a nevela? Because remember, if you have a treifa and you slaughter it properly, there's no laws of nevela anymore. It's not going to be impure. So that sounds good, but the Gemara is going to reject it because Umi Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish hachi. Wait. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish wouldn't say this. Why not? Because, and we're going to go back to this at the end of the daf, we're going to do a gufa, like let's understand this a little better. Hama Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish shachat kaneh, okay, which is the same as the gargeret. It's the windpipe. Now, what does the windpipe do? It's the pipe which down there goes the air to help you breathe. It goes from there to your lungs. So comes Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and he says, if you cut the kaneh, now, if you have a hole, a puncture in the lung, it's a treifa. But not if, according to Rish Lakish, if you cut the windpipe and after that you got a hole in the lung, the treifa problem happened after you cut the kaneh. Let's just assume before you cut the veshet, okay? So it wasn't yet dead. But, right, you hadn't finished the shechita, but you did cut the kaneh already. Then, what does he say? Alma kiman demancha b'dikula damya. Now, what's the issue? If the lung functions because of the kaneh, and you remove the kaneh, your lung, even though it's still technically in the body of the animal, they call it, it's like mancha b'dikula. It's like it's sitting in a basket. Okay? It's as if you took the lung out of the body already. Now, if I slaughter an animal, and I puncture some part of the animal after the animal's already slaughtered, right? It's obviously not a treifa. Who cares what I did after the animal's dead? So what they're saying is, even though I didn't kill the animal yet because I still didn't do the veshet, once I cut the kaneh, since that leads to the lung has no more ability to function, anything I do to the lung right now is completely irrelevant. So it won't make the animal a treifa. So the animal will be kosher, assuming I then slaughter the veshet properly. Okay, what does that have to do with this? Hachanami, like in our case, if the windpipe was already severed, and then I cut it in another place, and we try to say, oh, that's a kosher shechita. What do you mean? It's kemad demancha b'dikula damya. That windpipe was already completely useless. So I just cut something that was already cut. So you can't say there was any meaning to that action. And therefore, right, if Rish Lakish himself says that puncturing the lung won't ruin the animal, then because of the same logic, cutting that windpipe, once it was already severed, is not going to do anything. And therefore, you can't call that a kosher shechita, and you can't say that's what the other Mishnah is talking about, where the shechita was fine and just the animal was a treifa. So they reject Rish Lakish based on his own statement. Fourth answer, this is the easiest, and actually probably the most intuitive, even though it seems a little like not the smartest thing to be doing, but El Amr B'Chia Barabba Amr B'Yochanan Lo Kasha Kan Kodem Chazara Kan La'achar Chazara U'Mishnah Lo Zaza Mimkoma. Remember our Mishnah, now we have to go back. Our Mishnah gave these cases and said, Rabbi Yishevav says it's a nevela, Rabbi Akiva says it's a treifa, and then it says, but Rabbi Akiva changed his mind and was convinced that it's a nevela. And that's what caused the whole problem, because our whole Mishnah is all nevelas. And in the third chapter, one of the cases in our Mishnah is called a treifa. So what do they say? Oh, that Mishnah that calls it a treifa was according to Rabbi Akiva before he changed his mind. And what does it mean, Mishnah lo zaza mimkoma? We have a rule, this is what's not meant to be maybe the smartest thing. But once we have it as a Mishnah, even if somebody changes their mind or we find out it's wrong or something like that, we leave it the way it was. We've seen this a bunch of times already, where if we have a Mishnah and then we have some problem, we say, oh, the Mishnah actually maybe it was true at some point, but then they changed it. Well, we leave the Mishnah as is. So that's the point. There's no contradiction, because that Mishnah was Rabbi Akiva before he changed his mind. And our Mishnah is talking about Rabbi Akiva after he changed his mind, and therefore it's not a contradiction. There it's called a treifa, because it's Rabbi Akiva's position before he changed his mind. Here it's an avela, it's Rabbi Akiva after he changed his mind. Okay, but it's not so smart, because it definitely leads to confusion, as we see from our sugya. Now we're going to just do the gufa and go back to what Rish Lakish said, gufa. And we're just going to get started on this sugya today, and then we're going to end. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, so we're now going to just read it again. Shechita takaneh, you cut the windpipe, v'achar kach nikva re'ah, and then you end up with a puncture in the lung after, kshera, because the lung was already as if it's detached from the body at that point, because it wasn't functioning. Amar Rava, lo Amar Rabbi Shimon ela b're'ah. Okay, Rabbi Shimon only said this with the lung. Ho'il v'chayei re'ah tluyim b'kaneh, as we explained before, because the life of the lung, right, the functionality of the lung is dependent on the windpipe. Aval b'bnei me'ayim lo, but the stomachs, okay, the innards, are not relevant here, because they will function even if you don't have a kaneh, right? Because that's not leading to them, right? The gullet is leading to the b'nei me'ayim, which makes a lot of sense. Matkifla Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says, what are you talking about? I don't agree with you. Me'achar sheno duba simanei trefahi tarta. If you're going to say, once the kaneh is cut, it doesn't matter if there's simanei trefa that develop, mali b're'ah, mali b'bnei me'ayim. What's the difference? Whether it's the lung, whether it's the innards, right? Once you cut the kaneh, you're basically cutting off the life of the animal. Nothing that happens after that should be of significance and cause the animal to be a trefa. So it sounds like he's saying, if there's something in the b'nei me'ayim that happens after the windpipe is cut, it's not a treifa you can eat, which means basically you can eat the animal, right? Forget it's not a nevela, for sure. It's not a treifa, and you can actually, it's a kosher animal. Okay, the shechita is kosher. Not just if the lung has a puncture, but even the b'nei me'ayim. Now they're going to say, v'hadar bar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera changed his mind though. Okay, and it ends up agreeing with Rabbi. How do we know this? Based on a question Rabbi Zera asked. To buy Rabbi Zera, nikvu b'nei me'ayim, bein siman l'siman mahu. Now we ask, exactly this case. If you had a hole in the b'nei me'ayim, a puncture, in between the shefting of the two simanim, what's the halacha? Now, here we're going to ask. It's not now. You would have thought he said, right, is it kosher or is it not kosher? That's not what he says. Okay? Because by us he said it's kosher. even if he asked this question, okay, but now you're going to see his question is not, is it kosher or is it not kosher? His question is going to be, is it a treifa or an avela? But for sure it's not kosher, which obviously means that he changed his mind, because before he thought it was kosher. Now he's questioning, is it have tuma or not tuma? Okay, but obviously it's not kosher. And that's what we're going to see right now. When we slaughtered the first siman, then ended up with a puncture, and then continued to do the slaughtering, do we say this was a kosher slaughter? In the sense that, well, remember, if you have a treifa and you do a kosher slaughter, it prevents the treifa from becoming a nevela. It won't have impurity, but it's definitely not kosher. Okay? So does it mitzdarif siman rishon the siman sheni? Since you have this problem in the middle, do we still view this as, well, there were two simanim cut, and therefore l'tarami de nevela, it will remove nevela? Or do we say, oh, lo? Or do we say, no, you can't count the second one because there was already a nekev that happened in between, and the slaughtering it won't help you. But in any case, okay, we're going to continue on in this, but the main point being, and the Gemara will spell it out tomorrow, that he definitely doesn't think it can be eaten. And a minute ago he said, what do you mean? It's only the re'ah, right? But if the b'nei me'ayim, right, that's really, right, he says, he said, what's the difference? Re'ah b'nei me'ayim. If the re'ah got a hole, you can eat it. You should be able to eat it even if the stomach's got punctured. So here he definitely doesn't say that. So that's why he must have changed his mind. With that, we finish for today. Again, there's more to be said about that, so we'll get back to it tomorrow. We started with this issue of the para aduma. We combined the issue of the malacha for the para aduma together with if your shechita was done without any intention, and the machloket Rabbi Natan and the rabbis, and how each would fit in with this case of a para that you slaughtered at the same time you unintentionally slaughtered another animal. And with that, we also got to the dalad, to also cutting a gourd unintentionally, and we had a scale there of cases. Then we talked about shehiya, waiting in between. We had a whole bunch of 4 different definitions among the amoraim. First of all, machloket and the tannaitic. Is it shehiya of slaughtering an animal, or shehiya to check the knife? Within the slaughtering of another animal, we had, is it animal only? Is it bird for bird, or animal for bird also? Is it the amount of time it takes to put the animal down, to lift the animal and push it down, right? Different options, 4 different opinions. Then we got to the issue of ikor, uprooting a siman, and we had the 2 directions of the cases which led us to the whole problem, right? Whether the gargeret was cut before or cut after, which seemed both, and we had the chalada, and then we had the machloket Rabbi Shevav and Rabbi Akiva, that any kind of disqualification in shechita, is it a treifa or is it a nevela, right? Rabbi Akiva in the end is convinced that they're all nevelas. So everyone agrees in the end they're all nevelas if you have a disqualification in the shechita. It's a problem with the animal that doesn't have to do with the shechita, and the shechita was done properly, then it's only a treifa, and then it's not, doesn't carry impurity. From there we said, our Mishnah then contradicts the Mishnah in Elu Treifa, which lists what we have in our Mishnah as a nevela, lists that there is a treifa, and we have 4 different answers, 2 of which were rejected, 2 of which were accepted, right? The last one being that was before Rabbi Akiva changed his mind, and according to Rabbi Akiva. That was the simplest answer. And then we just went in depth into the 3rd answer of this Rish Lakish that brings up this issue of the punctured lung after the windpipe was already severed. And then we have a machloket Rava and Rabbi Zera, although Rabbi Zera in the end also changes his mind and goes to agree with Rava that it's only the lung, but if it was the problem in the stomach, it would actually cause the animal to be treifa. Okay, even if it happens after the windpipe is severed, because those aren't really connected. With that, we finish today's daf, wishing everyone a good day.